Dust coated the roof of Nora's mouth, tasting like burnt copper and old regrets. A room full of exhausted men went dead silent when the SEAL commander barked his desperate question. He needed a lunatic. Nora didn't feel brave. She simply hated sitting still while people died. Fluorescent lights hummed with a sick, erratic buzz, casting a jaundiced glare over 30 sweating bodies crammed into a temporary plywood briefing shack. Outside, the wind howled, hurling fine desert sand against the corrugated tin roof like handfuls of rock salt. Inside, the air was suffocating. It smelled of cheap instant coffee, unwashed Nomex flight suits, and the sour, metallic tang of adrenaline drying into fear. Nora Kessler sat in the back row, wedged into a corner near a leaky window frame. Her metal folding chair wobbled unevenly on the warped floorboards, the cold steel edge pressing hard against the back of her thighs. She dug a fingernail into a frayed thread on her knee, staring blankly at the map pinned to the whiteboard. Her head throbbed. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, surviving on nothing but ibuprofen and lukewarm water that tasted faintly of plastic. At the front of the room stood Commander Sam Becker. He didn't look like the recruiting posters. His face was grey beneath a thick layer of grime, eyes bloodshot and sunken into bruised pockets of skin. His tactical vest hung heavy with magazines and a radio that wouldn't stop spitting frantic, static-laced bursts. A recon unit was pinned down in a canyon 20 miles north. The weather was turning into a meat grinder. Standard medevac had scrubbed the flight. Too risky, Command said. Visibility was dropping below a quarter mile, and the wind shear off the canyon walls was enough to snap a rotor mast. Becker slammed his heavy, gloved hand onto the folding table. The sharp crack made half the room flinch. "I don't give a damn what the weather guys at Brass are saying," Becker growled, his voice a gravelly rasp, tearing through an exhausted throat. "I have 6 men bleeding out in a ditch. The local hostiles are closing the net. In 30 minutes they are overrun. I need a bird in the air." Silence dropped over the room like a wet wool blanket. The regular transport pilots exchanged heavy, uncomfortable glances. Men stared at the scuffed toes of their desert boots. A few shifted their weight, the nylon of their tactical gear scraping loudly in the quiet. It wasn't cowardice keeping them in their seats. It was cold, hard math. Flying a heavy transport helicopter into a zero-visibility canyon under heavy anti-aircraft fire was a suicide pact. You didn't save the men on the ground. You just added 4 more body bags to the manifest. Becker's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck pulled tight as he scanned the room, the desperation cracking through his hardened exterior. "Any combat pilots here?" he asked. The words hung in the stale air, thick and accusing. "Anyone with stick time who isn't afraid of a little wind?" More silence. A throat cleared somewhere in the second row. Nora felt her stomach turn over, a heavy, greasy roll of nausea. She wasn't an angel of mercy. She was cynical, tired, and her lower back felt like it had been hit with a hammer. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the grit grind beneath her eyelids. If she stayed seated, she could go back to her cot. She could take off her boots, peel off her sweat-soaked socks, and sleep. No one would blame her. She flew little birds, MH-6M, light attack choppers. She was close air support, not a heavy lift rescue jockey, but she also knew the canyon. She had flown it 3 weeks ago on a recon sweep, logging the jagged thermal drafts and the narrow, twisting egress routes. Nora opened her eyes. She placed her hands on her knees, the coarse fabric of her flight suit rough beneath her calloused palms. She pushed herself up. Her chair scraped backward against the plywood with a horrific, screeching squeal. The sound was jarring, entirely stripped of any cinematic grace. She bumped her knee against the folding table in front of her, stifling a quiet curse as her heavy boots found the floor. 30 pairs of eyes snapped to the back of the room. Nora didn't strike a heroic pose. She stood with a slight slouch, her shoulders aching, her hair pulled back into a messy, grease-slicked knot. She wiped a smudge of oil off her cheek with the back of her wrist, looking at Becca with a flat, unimpressed stare. "I've got a fully fueled AH-6 sitting on pad 4, Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was raspy, dry from the dusty air. "I can strip the rocket pods, pull the external ammo cans. That frees up enough weight for 6 guys to ride the exterior benches, if they don't mind holding on." Becca stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He took in her slight frame, the dark circles under her eyes, the scuffed, unpolished state of her gear. He looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to demand someone bigger, someone who fit the square-jawed savior profile. "You're Kessler," Becca said, his tone flat. "You fly the gunships." "Usually," Nora replied, shifting her weight off her throbbing right knee. "Today, I guess I'm an Uber." A murmur rippled through the seated pilots. One of them, a thick-necked warrant officer named Davis, half-turned in his chair. "Kessler, the wind shear in that gorge is pushing 50 knots. A little bird weighs practically nothing. You'll get swatted into the rocks before you clear the ridge." Nora didn't look at Davis. She kept her eyes locked on Becca. "If you take a Black Hawk, they'll hear you coming from 3 miles away, and you're too wide to maneuver below the radar floor in that canyon. They'll paint you with RPGs before you can drop the ramp. My bird is small, fast. I can hug the dirt, drop in, load your guys, and bounce." She didn't mention the part where flying an overloaded light helicopter through a sandstorm required holding the cyclic stick with the kind of white-knuckled tension that could tear a rotator cuff. She didn't mention that one stray bullet into her unarmored cockpit would drop them all from the sky like a stone. "You sure you can hold it steady while we load?" Becca asked, stepping forward. Nora reached into her chest pocket, pulling out a battered pair of aviator gloves. The leather was stiff with dried sweat. She began pulling them on, the Velcro tearing with a sharp, ugly rip. "I can hold it," she said, securing the strap around her wrist. "But we leave right now, or we don't leave at all." The walk to the flight line was a miserable, suffocating slog. The moment Nora pushed open the heavy steel door of the briefing shack, the desert swallowed them whole. The wind hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of moving dirt that instantly coated her teeth in grit and stung the exposed skin around her goggles. Becca and 2 of his gear-laden operators followed close behind her, leaning their bodies into the gale. The roar of the storm drowned out all thought. Nora kept her head down, her boots crunching heavily over the gravel and cracked tarmac. The floodlights around the perimeter fence were nothing but sickly yellow halos bleeding through the brown haze. The air smelled strongly of ozone, hot dust, and the heavy, sweet reek of JP-8 jet fuel spilling somewhere in the distance. Pad 4 sat at the far end of the runway. As they approached, the silhouette of the MH-6M Little Bird emerged from the blowing sand. It was a vicious, insect-like machine, painted matte black and stripped down to its barest essentials. It had no doors, no windows, no armor. It was basically a glass bubble strapped to a jet engine and a set of rotor blades. Nora didn't pause to admire it. She hated this part. The transition from walking on solid ground to strapping into the machine always felt like a surrender. Once she was in the seat, she belonged to the air, and the air was currently in a foul mood. She climbed into the right seat, her boots finding the anti-slip tape on the skids purely by muscle memory. The leather of the pilot's seat was cold. She dropped her helmet over her head, the heavy synthetic padding clamping down tightly against her ears, instantly muting the howling wind to a dull, pressurized roar. She reached up, yanking the harnesses down over her shoulders, the metal buckles clanking together with a heavy, satisfying metallic clack as she slammed them into the rotary release. "Pre-flight is done. We're hot," Nora muttered to herself, her hands flying across the overhead console. She didn't have time for the checklist. She knew the sequence by heart, a tactile memory ingrained in the calluses of her fingertips. Battery switch on, fuel pumps on, igniters armed. She pressed the starter. Behind her head, the Allison turbine whined, a low, guttural moan that steadily pitched up into a deafening scream. The airframe began to vibrate, a deep, bone-rattling shake that traveled up through the seat and into Nora's spine. The smell of burning kerosene flooded the open cockpit, sharp and stinging. The rotor blade slowly began to turn, chopping through the heavy, sand-filled air with loud, rhythmic thwacks. Becker and his 2 men approached the sides of the helicopter. They were carrying tools, heavy wrenches and power drills. In under 2 minutes, working with frantic, practiced efficiency, they unbolted the heavy rocket pods and external minigun ammo drums from the side pylons, letting the ordnance drop unceremoniously to the tarmac. They needed the weight savings. Every pound shed was an extra second of lift in the thinning air of the canyon. Nora watched them through the plexiglass bubble, her left hand resting lightly on the collective pitch lever, her right hand gripping the cyclic. The vibrations smoothed out slightly as the rotors reached flight idle, hitting 100% RPM. Becker climbed onto the right side exterior bench, securing his safety lanyard to a hard point. He leaned into the cockpit, his face inches from Nora's helmet. Even through her ear cups, she could hear the strain in his voice over the intercom channel. "Comms check," Becker barked. "Loud and clear," Nora replied. Her voice sounded thin and metallic in her own ears. "You guys better hold on. I'm going to have to pull max torque just to get us off the deck with this headwind. It's going to be ugly." "Just fly the damn bird, Kessler," Becker shot back, pulling his goggles down. Nora swallowed hard. The dry cotton feeling was back in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that she actively tried to suppress. She wasn't fearless. She was terrified. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to power down the engine, unbuckle and walk away. The control stick felt slick under her gloved hand, despite the friction tape. She took a short, sharp breath, tasting the kerosene and dust. She pushed the fear down into a tight, hard knot in her stomach, locking it away behind years of training and cynical stubbornness. "Tower, Myrmidon 2-2. Nora keyed her radio. "Departing pad 4, VFR, northwest heading." The radio crackled, spitting a wall of static before the exhausted tower controller broke through. "Myrmidon 2-2 tower, be advised. Sustained winds at 40 knots, gusting to 60. Visibility 0.1. You are cleared for departure at your own risk. Godspeed." "Copy," Nora said, clicking the radio off. She didn't want to hear anything else. She tightened her grip on the collective and slowly pulled upward. The engine howled, the turbine temperatures spiking on the digital gauges. The little bird groaned, the skid tubes peeling off the tarmac with a metallic scrape. Instantly, the wind caught them. The helicopter bucked violently to the left, a sickening lurch that made Nora's stomach drop. The controls fought her, jerking and twitching as the turbulent air tried to flip the lightweight machine over onto its side. Nora gritted her teeth, her muscles burning as she shoved the cyclic hard to the right, stepping heavily on the anti-torque pedals to keep the nose straight. It was like wrestling a greased pig on a sheet of ice. She didn't use finesse. She used brute force, forcing the aircraft into submission. "We're up!" Nora yelled over the intercom, her eyes locked on the faint, dusty glow of the perimeter fence, rushing towards them. She dipped the nose, feeding in more power. The little bird shot forward, tearing through the sandstorm, leaving the safety of the base behind. As they crossed the wire, the ground disappeared completely, swallowed by a churning ocean of brown. There was no horizon. There was no sky. There was only the violent shaking of the airframe, the deafening scream of the turbine, and the terrifying knowledge that the canyon walls were waiting somewhere in the dark. Navigation became a brutal, sickening guessing game played on instruments that were actively lying to her. Inside the narrow bubble canopy, the radar altimeter flickered. Its glowing green digits jumped from 50 feet to 200, dropped to an error code, and then flashed a warning stall. The blowing sand was utterly confusing the sensors. Nora ignored the panel. She flew by the pressure in her inner ear and the heavy, sluggish feedback of the cyclic stick grinding against her calloused palm. Every sudden downdraft threatened to slam the skid tubes into the desert floor. Every violent crosswind shoved the fragile airframe sideways toward unseen canyon walls. Her right forearm burned. Lactic acid pooled in her muscles from the constant, microscopic corrections required to keep the lightweight chopper upright in a Category 2 sandstorm. She hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes. Her eyes felt like dry, scratched glass. Fine dust seeped through the failing rubber seals of the canopy, coating the instrument panel in a powdery grit that only smeared into a greasy paste when she tried to thumb it away. "Becca!" Nora rasped into the intercom. Her throat felt tight, lined with sandpaper. "Give me a distance to the beacon. My nav screen is totally washed out." Static hissed back, sharp enough to make her wince. Then Becca's voice, compressed and distorted by the wind howling over his external mic. 2 miles. Keep hugging the deck. We're in the gorge now. Walls are closing in." Nora didn't need him to tell her that. She could feel it. The air pressure changed as the canyon funneled the storm, accelerating the wind and compressing the thermals. The little bird bucked like a mechanical bull, violently dropping 10 feet before a sudden updraft slammed them back up, compressing her spine into the hard seat cushion. She swallowed a surge of bile. The nausea wasn't just motion sickness. It was pure, unadulterated terror fighting against her muscle memory. She was flying blind in a trench of jagged granite. One wrong twitch of her wrist, one momentary lapse in concentration, and the main rotor would strike the rock face. The blades would shatter, the transmission would tear itself apart, and the fuselage would drop into the dark like a crumpled soda can. "I need flares," Nora barked. "I can't see the rock face. Drop a chem light. Drop something." "No!" Becca's voice cracked over the radio. "Hostiles are above us on the ridges. You pop a flare, you backlight us. They'll drop RPGs right on our heads. Fly the dark, Kessler." Nora let out a breath that sounded more like a dry sob. She hated him for being right. She squeezed her thighs together, shifting her feet on the anti-torque pedals to counteract a sudden tail kick. The turbine whined, a high-pitched scream of mechanical torture as she pushed the engine past its red line just to maintain forward momentum against the headwind. The smell of hot metal and burning synthetic oil filled the cockpit, sharp and toxic. Somewhere in the darkness to their right, a bright yellow flash briefly illuminated the swirling sand. Pop, pop, pop. The sound was muffled, distant, but the shockwave was undeniable. Anti-aircraft fire. The heavy caliber rounds tore through the air 100 yards ahead of their nose, leaving glowing red trails of tracer fire suspended in the dust. "They're shooting blind," Becca yelled. "They hear the rotor wash. Keep moving under their fire arc." Nora didn't reply. She dropped the collective, shoving the nose down. The helicopter dove, skimming so close to the canyon floor that the skids clipped the top of a dead scrub brush. The impact rattled through the floorboards, a hard, physical jolt that made her teeth clack together. She was hyperventilating now. Short, shallow breaths that did nothing to feed the oxygen starvation in her brain. The sweat rolling down her face was cold. She could smell her own fear, sour, sharp, mingling with the stench of the jet fuel. She wasn't a hero. She was an idiot who had raised her hand because sitting in a briefing room felt worse than this. Now, she wasn't so sure. "I have the infrared strobe," one of Becca's operators called out over the net. His voice was jarringly calm. 11 o'clock. Quarter-mile, bottom of the ravine. Nora snapped her head left. Through the night vision overlay of her goggles, the swirling brown dust turned into a chaotic sea of grainy green static. But there, pulsing weakly in the noise, was a rhythmic bloom of white heat. "I see it," Nora said. Her voice shook. She hated that Becca could hear it. "Approaching the LZ. It's too tight. I don't have room to flare the landing." "Make room," Becca replied coldly. Nora gritted her teeth. She pulled back hard on the cyclic, bleeding off their airspeed in a sudden, violent deceleration. The little bird shuddered, the main rotor blades biting into the turbulent air with a deafening, rhythmic wub, wub, wub. The tail whipped around, fighting her control inputs as the wind tried to spin them completely out of control. She stared down through the chin bubble of the cockpit. The ground rushed up. There was no flat spot, just jagged rocks, uneven gravel, and the heat signatures of 6 prone bodies huddled behind a shattered limestone outcropping. "Brace!" Nora screamed over the intercom. She dumped the collective. The little bird fell the last 10 feet like a stone. The landing gear slammed into the canyon floor with a bone-jarring crunch. The right skid struck a boulder, violently tilting the entire airframe to a 30-degree angle. Nora threw her weight to the left, jamming the cyclic against her knee to keep the rotors from biting into the dirt. The helicopter shrieked, metal groaning under the immense, unnatural stress. "We're down! Go, go, go!" Becca roared. Before the skids had even settled, Becker and his 2 operators unclipped their lanyards and threw themselves off the exterior benches. They vanished into the blinding wall of dust. Nora sat frozen, fighting the controls to keep the tilted bird pinned to the uneven ground. She couldn't see anything outside the plexiglass. The rotor wash had whipped the loose sand into an impenetrable, abrasive tornado. The noise was absolute. The engine screamed, the wind howled, and then, cutting through it all, the flat, mechanical hammer of heavy machine gun fire. Sparks showered over the nose of the helicopter as a stray round struck the dirt just inches from the chin bubble. Nora flinched violently, ducking her head behind the instrument panel. It was a useless, instinctual reaction. The thin fiberglass shell wouldn't stop a 7.62mm round. If they hit her, she was dead. She felt naked, strapped into a glass box in the middle of a firing squad. "Load them up!" a voice screamed over the external radio net. It wasn't Becca. It was someone younger, frantic. Shadows emerged from the dust. Hands slammed against the side of the airframe. The helicopter rocked violently as dead weight was thrown onto the exterior benches. Nora smelled fresh blood over the kerosene. It was a heavy, metallic copper scent that instantly coated the back of her throat. "Two aboard!" More gunfire. A loud, wet slap hit the side of the fuselage. Someone screamed, a ragged, breathless sound of pure agony. "Get him up! Pull him!" The helicopter shifted again, groaning as the suspension collapsed further under the added mass. Nora watched her weight and balance gauges scream into the red. They were wildly overloaded. A little bird was designed to carry a crew of 2 and maybe 4 operators on the planks. She now had Becker, his 2 men, and 6 wounded recon soldiers hanging off the sides like desperate barnacles. "Becker!" Nora yelled into the mic. "I'm maxed. I don't have the torque to lift this much weight in this wind. Pull the damn stick, Kessler." Becker's voice was right behind her ear. He had climbed onto the skid, one arm hooked through the safety harness, the other blindly firing his rifle into the dust. "They're 50 yards out. Lift off or we all die right here." A bullet punched through the upper canopy, leaving a jagged, spider-webbed hole in the plexiglass before tearing out through the roof. The loud crack deafened Nora's left ear. Panic, raw and electric, surged through her chest. She didn't think anymore. She just pulled. She yanked the collective pitch lever up, twisting the throttle grip to the firewall. The turbine shrieked, a high-pitched wail that vibrated her teeth. The digital torque gauge flashed 110%, dangerously past maximum limits. The transmission temperature warning light illuminated, casting a harsh red glow over her trembling hands. The little bird didn't want to fly. It wallowed, the skids scraping agonizingly across the rocks. "Come on, you piece of junk, come on!" Nora screamed aloud, her voice tearing her raw throat. She aggressively dumped the nose forward, trading altitude for airspeed, dragging the skids through the dirt until the rotors finally found enough clean air to bite. With a sickening lurch, the overloaded chopper ripped free of the earth. They were airborne, but just barely. They crawled upward, skimming just feet above the canyon floor. The heavy mass of the men on the benches acted like a pendulum, fighting every correction Nora made. She couldn't climb over the ridge. She had to fly straight down the throat of the gorge, weaving blindly through the rock pillars. Behind her, the gunfire faded, swallowed by the roar of the storm and the screaming engine. No one spoke on the radio. The intercom was dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of men who had just cheated the Reaper. Nora's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She locked her elbows against her ribs, using her entire upper body to hold the cyclic steady. Her flight suit was soaked through with cold sweat, clinging to her spine. She tasted blood. She had bitten her lip so hard during the liftoff it was freely bleeding down her chin. The 20-mile flight back to base was a blur of agonizing muscle cramps and the constant, terrifying red glare of the transmission warning light. When the sickly yellow halos of the perimeter runway finally pierced the dust storm, Nora didn't feel relief. She just felt hollow. She didn't bother calling the tower. She dragged the battered little bird over the wire and slammed it down onto the tarmac of Pad 4. It was a sloppy, brutally hard landing that bounced the airframe before it settled heavily on its struts. Nora killed the engine immediately. The whine of the turbine spooled down, the sudden quiet rushing into the cockpit like a physical wave. Outside, medics were already swarming the bird, pulling the bleeding men off the benches. Flashlights cut through the dust. Shouts echoed across the flight line. Nora didn't move. She unbuckled her helmet and let it drop onto the empty seat beside her. She unclipped her harness with clumsy, trembling fingers. She rested her forehead against the cool, dusty curve of the cyclic stick. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there, listening to the metallic pinging of the cooling engine, breathing in the smell of hot oil, dried blood, and the unforgiving desert dirt. Did this story keep you on the edge of your seat? The reality of combat aviation isn't about glory. It's about raw survival, cold sweat, and pushing the absolute limits of human endurance under impossible pressure. If you want more gritty, realistic military stories that strip away the Hollywood polish and show the real human cost, hit that like button, share this video with your crew, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Could you hold the stick under fire?